The world's greatest vagina, or Homage to the Whist Maiden, based on a true story. The narrator hears the tale of a famous game of cards. There is no pressing necessity to tackle any widespread consternation in reports that the card-playing habits of the Riverland towns dwell not surreptitiously around that mainstay of British perfidy, 52-card whist. There are whist enthusiasts throughout the entire Antipodes and the wider colonies, no doubt. But for whatever reason, demographic or incidental, there is a robust concentration in those rustic hubs that service trade along the Giddens and the mighty Murrumbidgee. There are whist clubs in all the major centres, in fact, more or less wheresoever men and sheep do dwell, for the evenings are there sultry with dry dissipation, and the boon of modern telecommunications has not quite transformed old-fashioned habits. There are, as readers will appreciate, numerous well-known variations on the classical British game, dummy whist and call ace the most notable, as well as so-called Minnesota whist, that American abomination. Then there's knockout whist, dead man's whist, Russian whist, Prussian whist, twist whist, and that deviation known widely as oh hell. Then there is progressive whist, where, unconscionably, one suit is declared trumps at the beginning of the day. For historical reasons, to do with the Irish probably, as with all aberrations, the people of the region thereupon took to the somewhat prosaic hybrid known as bobby, the bobby being the jack of diamonds, and whosoever makes the trick with it knows instant valediction and takes home the kitty. It is a slow-moving game, and that is how they like it there among the river towns. I'm sitting with Jim Finko, the proprietor of Finko's fine food and surfing attire, and glancing at the empty highway stretching outwards into the sprawling desert. And he brings out his handy deck and starts the famous backward shuffle. He is for many decades a mover in the broader whist community. There is precious little to do in the outer reaches of Marong Lee, and a good game of bobby intersperses the calendar of camel races and the ever-absorbing war on blowflies. For his part, aside from whist, Finko plays chicken with the tax dragoons, which explains the conspicuous stock of surfboards and swimming trunks on sale at a greasy eatery 400 miles from the sea. I am remarking on the new season range of Fijian-themed skivvies and novelty thongs. It's a lucrative write-off. He makes a loss every financial declaration, which has a happy outcome on his tax return, and has never sold so much as a leg rope in 35 years. A dusty old wetsuit hangs limp upon the wall. Nice, I say, referring to the tropical colours and Fijian variegations. A hand or two, says he, holding up the cards, checking that there are no customers on the far horizon. And I say, why not? For my part, the real attraction is the many tales that might accompany every 13-card spread. Finko is a habitually loquacious man, and will try to throw an opponent off his game with a twisty yarn and long-winded anecdote of unlikely provenance. Finally, that is why you would go to Finko's. You certainly wouldn't go there for the toasted sandwiches. I have heard all such tales already, of course, but always enjoy the reruns. One of my favourites is the tale of the great whist drive of 1996, and he knows it. We both pretend that it has never yet been told, and that all the details are entirely fresh upon the tongue. Have I told you the story about the woman with the world's greatest vagina? He says. I look up. He's dealing with panache. You may have, I admitted, and then invited him to refresh my memory. In fact, of course, it was one of his big guns, a story almost certain to throw a man off his game, and he obviously judged me susceptible. Tell me again, I dared him. Readers should also appreciate that your narrator is not entirely a simpleton when it comes to whist psychology, and so is not entirely unprepared. Conversely, it also happened that Finko himself could hardly remain undistracted by the tale in its telling, and apart from being heavy-grade ammunition, it was also a story he loved to tell. The eatery attracted a fairly predictable spray of clients. There had been some great hands of whist, for sure, but when something of merit occurred, it becomes indelible, and Finko added it to his repertoire. Moreover, it was an abode for gentlemen, Finko's, and had that aroma, and so it wasn't every day that the woman with the world's greatest vagina stepped through the door, which, he likes to relate, is what happened. In any case, Finko took the occasion of the roll call to reminisce. Several of the players in that famous game had since checked out. Cable Bill from Cable Hill, for example, who died of misery and rheumatoid arthritis. He was wired, Cable Bill, said Finko, having finished the deal and holding his cards characteristically nearby to his chest. He was a sly player, Finko, quite apart from his psychological manoeuvres. He always seemed to gravitate to aces, and the bobby often favoured him. I was more a full trick man, known for a daring flourish. It required concentration. I had never met Cable Bill. He was before my time. This was in 1996, I asked, playing along. That's right, said Finko. January, a stinker of a day, 45 outside. I looked up at the air conditioner and pondered the fact that it had only been recently installed. As we settled into our game, he rehearsed the events that had set the tale in motion. Among the other competitors in the famous game was Father Maiden, a whist enthusiast, like all clergymen. There was Flash Darren Fenwick, Gus Gimley, Boomer Geechee, and Finko's bitter rival, Seth of the Biceps, a truck driver who did relays to Sydney and back. I had known Seth for years, Finko related. When it came to whist, I knew he was capable of anything. But Finko was unprepared for what soon transpired. The occasion, anyway, was a whist drive to raise money for Wolf Sturger's hip replacement. This is to put the game in context. It wasn't a league game, it was a charity match. But when Seth of the Biceps arrived in his long haul, rumbling in the dust, there was an element of begrudgery between them. I could beat Seth at whist on any dry day, Finko reckoned. He had beaten him hands down again and again, bobby after bobby. Their friendship, nevertheless, extended to cooking false travellogues for Seth's dodgy distances, which is another way Finko made war on the tax dragoons. They were well into the third trick, Finko explained, when suddenly, out of the 45-degree nowheres, a young woman walked in, fresh as a daisy. It was a rare occurrence at the most ordinary of times, but it was even more disconcerting when she started looking at surfwear. 1996 was a big year for whist, and for surfwear. Finko had imported a glaring range of batik-themed accoutrements from a shyster in Bali, and the tax write-off on the loss funded his mortgage. But this young lady waltzed into the store, looked casually about, and started fingering surfwear as if she was buying, and as if surf was up. Surf, let us remember, is 400 miles away. We just ignored her, said Finko. What was there to say? Can I help you, miss? Finko didn't know anything about surfwear. The scorching wastes were sucking up every drop of moisture outside. The game, of course, had just at that moment reached fever pitch. The blowflies were busy. Cable Bill had thrown in a 6. Finko was sitting majestic with a king. The bobby was lurking in the pack. And Seth of the Biceps had overplayed his hand again. This was the golden moment. The surfer girl dallied a bit, browsing and looking around, and then ambled over to the table. Everybody looked up. "Hello, boys," she said. "I've got the world's greatest vagina." "She what?" I said. "That's what she said," said Finko. "She just walked up and said it." She was from Yakandanda, it turned out, but that is no excuse. Just at that moment, Flash Darren Fenwick had been sipping on his Coca-Cola and did a blowback into his can, everywhere. Gus Gimley lost his footing in his seat and his elbow gave way. Boomageechee dropped his guard in stunned suddenhood, and everybody could see his cards. "Jesus, Joseph and Mary," muttered Father Malin. Every man has seen the movie. Some stud stands up and says, "Oh yeah, prove it, bitch." But this is not one of those movies. This is a handy game of charity whist at Finko's Fine Foods and surfing attire on a stinking day in 1996. "Well," says Finko, "that set the cat among the pigeons, I can tell you." He laughed. I resisted this time yet again the occasion for a pussy joke. As the proprietor, Finko had launched to his feet. "Now," he says, "can I help you, miss?" "Who won the game?" I asked, looking ahead. "Hang on," he says. She walks up, says this to us. The whole game goes to rack and ruin. Does it? Well, Father Malin, for a start, throws in his hand and says he's out. "Who was she?" I asked. "Hang on. The game goes to Al in a handbasket, and I think Boomageechee might be having a blood pressure episode because his face is going blue and he doesn't say a thing, when Seth, of the biceps, stands up and says to the girl, 'Jesus, Maureen.'" "Her name was Maureen then," I confirm. Seth stands up and says, "Jesus, Maureen." And she turns on him and says, "What?" Seth says to her, "What was that?" "Well, I didn't know what to say," she complained back. "Seth of the biceps," I said. He was a ladies' man, Seth of the biceps. There are girls who'll do anything for biceps. On this occasion, Maureen, the surfer girl from Yakandanda, had loitered in Seth of the Biceps' long haul in the car park and had, by their arrangement, agreed to saunter in and say something off-putting. "What do you want me to say?" she had said. "I don't know," Seth had said. "Think of something. Something that will put men off a game of whist." There are few things that can put men off a game of whist, Maureen had thought to herself. Seth overplayed his design, I ventured. "By the bobby," said my opponent, using card lingo. Seth was saying, "What were you thinking, Maureen?" Maureen realised she had miscalculated and burst into tears. Seth was saying, "You just had to distract them, baby. Just something to put them off their cards." I considered my own cards at this point in the tale's telling. I liked the way Maureen sauntered casual and dallied with the surfwear and gave no introductions. I liked the way Father Malin lapsed into blasphemy. In some retellings, Finko had him reach in his pocket for holy water. "I am shocked," I said. "Did that really happen?" "A blight on the history of whist in the Riverlands," said Finko, "that a player could resort to such skullduggery. Seth pulls a floozy and it wrecks the whole spread." The day's competition ended in ructions. Not a cent was raised for Wolf Sturger's hip replacement. "It is clearly contrary to the spirit of the game," I agreed. "The very idea that you would try to put a man off his cards when he was trying to concentrate." I picked up a 9 of clubs. "That's right," said Finko. "All she had to do was ask me about some surfwear. I would have been stumped. That's enough to put me off my cards. There are many things that Maureen might have said, no doubt. In the event, she had a failure of imagination. The Biceps had met her at a truck stop near Albury, and for reasons unexplained, she had to get to Adelaide to see her cousin. Finko could recite the entire saga, although he had other stories just as lurid to throw an opponent off his mark. There was the story about the Kelpie and the sausage, for example. But the story of the world's greatest vagina had the trumps. She just walked right up to us, said Finko again. I picked up the 4 of diamonds. Bummer. I was shaking my head as if it was the craziest thing I had ever heard a surfer girl from Yakandanda do. Did she buy anything? I wondered, laughing. Seth of the Biceps bought her an ice cream to calm her down, said Finko merely. Cable Bill was wiry, you say? As tight as a piano wire, said Finko. This was one occasion I thought he was going to snap. Cable Bill was terrified of females at the best of times. Flash Darren, soaked in coke, wasn't much better. Father Malin, of course, considered them evil. I wasn't sure where this story was going, I said, when she first walked up to the table. Who has not known women like Maureen? You ask her to buy you a drink, she comes back with a soda fountain. I didn't think it quite a blight on the history of whist in the Riverlands, though. Just another moment of local colour. It underlined the lengths to which avid players go. Over the years, every dirty trick in the book has been pulled at some game at whist clubs in all the major centres. You can be sure. That is why it is a mainstay of British perfidy. The British only play games good for cheating. It is not a difficult game though, 52-card whist, and the hybrid form Bobby is without unnecessary complications, which is what makes it so popular. But it is a game of mind against mind, rather than a game of lady luck and her anatomy. At this moment, suddenly, Finko pulled the Bobby on me, and I was done. I looked at him. What happened? Damn it, Finko, I said. You put me off my cards.